This began just musing about the extraordinary role that relatively recent developments in communication have played through these weeks of global pandemic. And before I could say lockdown, I was off on an indulgent trip down memory lane. I must have been about 7 or 8 when the main focus of my weekly reading was still the Beano, and in particular, one of my favourite strip comics called Little Plum, which would now be censored as an outrageous stereotype of First Nations North Americans. What I especially remember was Little Plum's repeated use of his state-of-the-art communication system, sending fake news smoke signals to play tricks on his socially distant friends and foes. It meant, of course, that he could message way beyond the day-to-day limits of human communication, more normally only as far as he could shout. This pioneering technology exploited the simple fact that we can see much further than we can hear, and that messages could be encoded in low-tech digital puffs. Humans had, of course, exploited the benefits of long-distance seeing for a long time, spotting distant fires and volcanic dangers as columns of smoke pointed towards the sky. Rosemary and I revisited that only this week when we spotted a column of smoke whilst on one of our cycling high peak district highs. A plume rising in the distance, we now know originating from a large fire on the Sankey Valley Industrial Estate at Newton Le Willows, over 30 miles away. It was also the Beano, or was it the Dandy, that triggered some of my earliest scientific experimenting. Later generations, our own children included, would use yogurt pots. But for me, it was 2 empty baked bin tins and a piece of string the length of our garden. My sister conscripted as an early telephonist, commissioned under threat of reprisals to keep the string tight. My parents did not have a real telephone until I was a late teenager. But it was as a Cub Scout in the 1950s that one of the more trendy young leaders showed us some early Bakelite telephone microphones. I think he'd purloined them from work, and showed us how, using just 2 strands of wire, you could talk around corners, no batteries needed, with folk you could neither hear nor see. This really upstaged the semaphore flags and Morse code flashing torches that featured in our Cub Scout badges. And I was off on my techie way. I was not that much older when I found that I could do the same thing with a couple of speakers rescued from broken radios. Actually, we called them wirelesses in those days, which makes reasonable sense, I suppose. And this time I had my mum on the other end, talking to her out of sight round the corner in the next room. In my early teenage years, no one had yet thought to exploit semiconductor junctions. Transistor was a word that no one had coined. So I made a crystal set and listened to Radio Luxembourg. Remember that? Late at night on earphones with a 100-foot single strand aerial out of my bedroom window. I then made one valve transmitters and receivers and had my mum doing Morse code from the bottom of the garden with a Morse key made from tin plate. There goes another baked bean tin. It was only near the end of my school days, about 1967, nearing the time I would go to Cambridge, initially to read electrical engineering, that I went on a visit to the science laboratories at Nottingham University and saw for the first time a cathode ray screen linked to a laboratory at NASA in the US, watching near live data arriving relayed by some of the first experimental satellites hanging beneath balloons over the mid-Atlantic. It was not until 1980s, working on a doctorate, that I got my hands on one of the first generation BBC micros, my first go on an early word processor, but still no sign whatsoever of email or the internet. It was not until I was in Manchester in the 1990s that I had my first email address, care of Manchester University. But so few folk I knew had a computer at that time that hardly anyone ever emailed me. Only later were we introduced to a World Wide Web, late offspring of that link to NASA 20 years earlier. At first, it was very clunky, lots of whistles and interruptions when connecting, and truth to tell, not a lot to look at, even if you made it. Then, before you could say terabyte, the college was needing a website. And whiz bang wallop, we were learning water-free surfing, and someone came up with the soundbite, social media. Facebook was born, iPlayer arrived, and the first Skype conversations began to link across the world. Now we zoom around the planet doing virtually anything we like in chat rooms, like this one here today. Finally, and to be truthful, this was the event that triggered all this nostalgia. Yesterday, I was party to a minor digital accident. No one, I'm glad to say, sustained lasting injuries. Unbeknown to me, the iPhone in my pocket decided, quite unsolicited, to call Kerry via WhatsApp. It would not have mattered, but it was the early hours of the morning in New Zealand. The next thing I know, my phone is vibrating a second time and a woozy voice is asking if I'm okay. That really takes the biscuit, as my grandma used to say. I am subject of a minor digital accident in Whaley Bridge. A loyal friend wakes up in Christchurch, New Zealand, and immediately contacts me, worried lest I might be in trouble. Wow, we've certainly come a long way since the days of smoke signals